From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon. Hello, I'm Ron Charles. I'm the editor of the Washington Post book section. I'm so glad you're here today for the National Book Festival. First, a word of thanks to our co-chairman of the festival, David Rubenstein, and many other sponsors who've made this event possible. If you'd like to add your support, there is a note about how you can donate in your program. We will have time for questions after we're done talking, and I've been asked to remind you that if you come to the mic, you will become part of the library's permanent collection on videotape. So if you're in like a witness relocation program or something, just stay in your chair. Today I have the great honor of talking to one of America's literary giants, Joyce Carol Oates. She began publishing in 1964, and she's published more than 40 novels, along with dozens of collections of short stories and poetry and nonfiction. If I listed all the awards and honors she has received, we would never have time to talk. But let me just give you a sense of the breadth of her work. Her short stories have won the Rhea Award, the PEN/Malamud Award, the World Fantasy Award, the Bram Stoker Awards, the O. Henry Awards. One of her novels was a National Book Award. She's been a frequent finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. The bookies keep telling us she's going to win the Nobel Prize some year. She won the Lifetime Achievement Award from the National Book Critics Circle, along with the National Humanities Medal. In addition to all the wonderful books like Them and Blonde and I'll Take You There and The Falls, she's taught and encouraged generations of students at Princeton University and elsewhere. Some of these people you know, like Jonathan Safran Foer and Walter Kern, and some of them you don't know, like prisoners at San Quentin Prison. Her latest books are a memoir called The Lost Landscape, a writer coming of age, and a novel called A Man Without a Shadow, about a relationship between a scientist and a famous amnesiac. It is so wonderful to have you here today.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
Thank you for doing this. I should mention really that your most recent book came out this week. It's a collection of your critical writings.
Yes.
It's called Soul at the White Heat, Inspiration, Obsession, and the Writing Life. Now that title, Soul at the White Heat, comes from an Emily Dickinson poem.
Yes, it's an Emily Dickinson poem. It's a typically very passionate Emily Dickinson poem that is really about the making of poetry. Dare you see a soul at the white heat? Sort of come closer and see the artist at his or her creativity.
And what does that phrase mean in your own life and your own work?
Well, I think it's something that sort of runs through my mind. Dare you see a soul at the white heat? First of all, it seems to suggest that we have souls, that we're spiritual beings, that there's something almost impersonal and transcendental about us that's not merely petty and immediate, but something deeper. All those things, I think, come into play when we are imagining, when we're immersed in the imagination. We sort of move away from the pettiness and transience of life into something more abiding and deeper that has a kind of communal feeling with other people.
In that collection, you mentioned that one of the first short story writers that really turned you on to literature was Ernest Hemingway.
Oh, yes.
Which surprised me. I love your books. I don't think of you like Ernest Hemingway. You seem very different. Very different.
Well, I always teach Hemingway, particularly at the start of a writing workshop in the beginning of a semester, a quintessential Hemingway story like Indian Camp or Hills Like White Elephants. It has almost like a skeletal structure. It's very pure and very clear. Often characters don't even have names, maybe just a young man or a young woman, and they have an intense dialogue and their lives are changed. And it may be 1 or 2 pages, 3 pages long. It's something very beautifully wrought, almost a kind of calligraphy, beautiful writing of selection and emphasis, rather than a maximalist art that has a lot of detail. This is a minimalist art that's very beautiful. So for a writer who is more of a maximalist, you still have that skeletal structure. I mean, it may be 3 pages in Hemingway, but if you're a writer who wants to put more of the world in and describe people and so forth, you basically still need that structure and that trajectory of people's lives being changed.
You start that way with a novel? You have it that pared down?
I always have the ending, I have the beginning, and the trouble's the middle.
Yeah.
Now, I'd like to have a title, a beginning, and an ending.
A title?
The title, the beginning, and the ending have a kind of a triangular architectural relationship, so it's like a center of gravity that's fixed. Then you know what you're doing as you go through the novel, you have a destination and you know what you're doing.
Your publisher doesn't come along and say, no, Joyce, we want this title. This title didn't pan well with our test audience.
Well, that hasn't happened yet.
In one of those essays, you write, the most serious and productive artists are haunted by their material.
Yes.
Haunted. Were you just being hyperbolic, or do you mean haunted?
Well, you can't really write or have much art that's galvanized by emotion if you haven't really identified with it, in some unconscious way. So people all have true stories. They have their own true voice and true stories. And some people come to these true stories immediately when they're young.
Right.
Others have to sort of work toward it. I mean, there are very well-known and brilliant writers, I think, like Toni Morrison, who maybe published her first novel when she was 40. Then there are some writers who come along and they get their true subjects when they're 20. I'm not sure why that's so different. Sometimes life intervenes, especially for women.
Right.
They may get married, have children, and then the sort of latency of what they have to say will come out later when they're not so distracted by real life.
Does writing help exorcise that haunted feeling for you?
I don't know if it exercises it. It kind of exercises it,
Okay.
and makes it, puts it in a context. Some of the most thrilling writing that we can read it comes from the heart. And I'm not sure that it's cathartic. It sort of dramatizes our human condition of interacting with one another.
Yes.
Like a typical play or Shakespearean tragedy, people come together and they interact, and out of their relationship, a scene is created, and out of our relationships with people, stories are created, real stories in our lives, people who meet, and then they have these relationships. Their whole lives may be bound up together forever, It may have seemed like an accidental meeting. So life is like a mimicry of art.
Speaking of haunted, you were, you may still be, the only woman to receive the Horror Writers Association's Bram Stoker Award.
I'm not the only one.
You're not the only one anymore. You were the first woman.
Oh, was I?
Yes.
The first woman?
Right.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
And you've edited
Bram
H.P. Lovecraft's work.
That's right.
You've written some fantastic stories yourself, along with some terrific Gothic novels. I adored The Accursed. I just talked to Stephen King. He adored that too.
Oh,
by the
that's
way.
so nice.
Yeah. What draws you to horror, to the Gothic sensibility?
Well, Gothic sensibility is almost entirely a literary sensibility.
What do you mean by that? Explain that to us.
Well, there were never really any haunted houses. So
Oh, Joyce.
if you're writing a novel about haunted houses, vampires, werewolves, and so forth, you are not looking back to an actual era where these things happen. You're looking back to literature.
Okay.
It's the most traditional of all the forms is Gothic literature. It pays homage to predecessors. You're probably looking back to Edgar Allan Poe or Lovecraft. And so, or you might be looking back to Emily Bronte, sort of a little bit of the Gothic and the Bronte's writings.
Yes.
So it's a traditional literature that's respectful of predecessors.
And this attracts you to it?
Yes, I think if we think of the image of the vampire, for instance, we are probably talking in psychological terms about a class structure in which there are people at the bottom disenfranchised and powerless. They may have been peasants in Europe or serfs. And up here you have the landowner or you have the nobleman. And this could be, quote, Count Dracula. And so you're right. The vampire saga or image or epic, is actually a social and psychological commentary on human life. So the vampire, who's Dracula, is the nobleman. He's sucking the blood of the common people. He's taking the life, he's taking the young people. This is just a way of talking about politics, but it's a Gothic trope. Then the werewolf, we think, is probably a dramatization, very literal, like fur coming out of the face and so forth, of what Freud would call the id in human beings, the unconscious that comes out, is rapacious and can be quite evil and destructive and self-destructive. So the werewolf as a symbol is a dramatization of something that's psychological and quite normal.
Would you admit that there's a certain element of comedy in some of your Gothic novels?
Yes, my novels are postmodernist novels because I'm writing at a time when I could not write a Gothic novel because it's in literary history, if we're writing about a vampire, we can't be writing about a vampire for the first time. Right. You're in a whole tradition. Right. So your vampire should be a little different from the other vampires.
Yes.
But the first vampire in Bram Stoker's Dracula, that first vampire was partially like a bat. You remember you've seen Nosferatu, that film? He's actually a human being, but partly also an animal, a bat, sucking blood. Then the vampire image, as it was sort of modified, became more and more a seductive image. Like there was nothing seductive about Nosferatu. Yeah. It's really pretty awful. But the idea of a seductive and handsome Dracula, this would be Bela Lugosi in the movies. Some people may have not thought he was terribly attractive, but I'm partly Hungarian, so my expectations are a little different from other people. So that's kind of interesting that the Nosferatu image starts out as repellent and animal, but then it gets modified and more romantic. So then the Twilight novels, for young readers, I believe, the Twilight novels will show a very handsome vampire. So that's interesting that evolved.
And you add elements of comedy to that.
In my novel, The Accursed, yes, the vampire is obviously a romantic figment of women's imaginations. Women are imagining this person who's so incredibly handsome. I mean, it seems silly, actually.
Yes, funny.
Yeah,
yes.
It's funny. If you know any real men,
which like, some of you do.
I mean, a real man, an actual human man, doesn't look or act like this. This is like a silly image or an idealized man. But if you're actually, I'm getting in trouble here. But my husband's not actually here, so. I mean, domestic realism is probably the hardest genre in which to write because you're dealing with realism, real people, children and marriage and so forth. It's a little harder to write in that mode than it is to write these romantic modes where all the negative things are sort of airbrushed out. Everybody's handsome and their relationships are operatic rather than what we get in daily life, which I won't go into. It's not operatic, though.
Let's talk about that tension with the reality and fantasy. Your two most recent books, except for the collection, your memoir and The Man Without a Shadow, both have to do with the fragility of memory, would you think?
Yes, well, The Man Without a Shadow is literally about a man who has lost part of his brain. He's been injured with encephalitis, which causes swelling of the brain, and part of the brain can be damaged, and then your short-term memory is affected. But his long-term memory was not affected, so he's 37 when that happened. He has all the memory up until when he's 37, and then after that, he has a memory of only 70 seconds.
So it's sort of the opposite of the memoirist problem, who can remember everything more recently but has more trouble remembering distant events.
Well, the memoirist, I think, the human brain is equipped to remember distant things most accurately. You can't really remember what you had to eat last week much. You don't remember your dreams of probably last night. Most of us have forgotten. But you will remember your first grade class. And some people can shut their eyes and go around the room and remember the sixth grade classroom and everybody sat in the seat. And that's what the brain is. Our brain is equipped to remember things that go way, way, way back. Our parents, our first friends, things that happened when we were very young. And we learn language.
Right.
We have a grip of language that's very strong.
But as you wrote those autobiographical essays that you collected in that memoir, didn't you sometimes wonder if you remembered things accurately?
Well, I mention it often in my memoir.
Yes.
That there's a kind of amnesia between the ages, I think, of, until a child is, 5 or 6 years old. There's a time in there where we really don't remember anything.
No.
Some memoirists will pretend to remember things, but it's not really likely. We can bolster our memories by looking at snapshots. The photographs are very...
Are we creating memories or bolstering them?
Well, in my novel, The Man Without a Shadow, this person has lost, as I said, his memory from he knew. So the experiments with these people, which have been conducted mostly with HM, you've probably read about them, these experiments are very interesting. Mm-hmm. For instance, you put a wristwatch, you give a watch to one of these amnesiac patients, and you ask him, "Oh, where'd you get that?" Now, he won't remember. He doesn't really know how that got there. But he will say, "Oh, I've always had this." Or he'll say, "Somebody gave it to me for my birthday." In other words, we make up reasons. We don't really have the memory, but we make up a plausible answer. When people are interviewed, often people have no idea how to answer. So we make up plausible, reasonable, sane-sounding answers. Unless we want to be really wild and crazy and like run for president and make up all kinds of... But we most of us make up plausible answers, and then after we've made them up, we remember those, and so the next time we give those answers.
Tell me about the inspiration for your book.
Yeah, some things like that, the inspiration. People often don't know how to answer these questions.
So they just make something up.
Well, why did you fall in love? Why did you fall in love with that particular person and get married? Well, in a way, you don't know how to answer that. So you say, well, the first time I saw him or her, you know. So you kind of make a little narrative, but then the next time you're asked, you have the narratives right there.
It seems plausible, even believable. Yeah. Isn't that what the memoirist does, is project a kind of reasonable narrative over the disordered events of his life?
That completely depends on the narrator and on the memoirist. Some people will go back and assiduously do research. Some people just kind of make it up.
Yes.
There are wonderful memoirists like Frank McCourt and Mary Karr and some others. They're really wonderful. But I noticed they have a lot of dialogue and remembered, with quotation marks. I'm not sure how realistic that is. But obviously they are remembering an emotional atmosphere and they're putting in what's plausible.
Right. Now this is just one example of the kind of research you do for a book. And a lot of your books seem to require this kind of specialized research. Is that the case? You do research for novels, for fiction?
Well, it depends pretty much on what the novel is. The Man Without a Shadow, I certainly did research. And my husband is a neuroscientist, so in his study at home are shelves of these books on neuroscience and memory, the science of memory, which is really interesting to read about. And then HM, Suzanne Corkin's book on HM, the permanent present tense, a person who's living in the present tense. That was a book that I read. I knew Suzanne Corkin, though not well, but she was a distinguished neuroscientist at MIT who died about a year ago, or even less. So I read that book. But basically, when you're writing a novel, you're sort of populating a mythical world with people who who are acting out a story that's plausible in terms of yourself. You know, like, would I say this? Would I do this? How realistic is this? So my writing tends to have a psychological, realistic perimeter. I don't go outside the plausibility of psychological realism.
But the characters in your novel frequently experience things more dramatic than the events of your own life.
Yes, that's true.
Frequently.
Yes, yes.
Your own life has been, from the outside, it looks relatively pleasant and unviolated and successful.
Well, we all suffer losses. You know, the losses that we suffer in our families can be catastrophic. They're not unusual because we all suffer them.
True.
But one loss in your life that's profound may be quite enough, you know.
Right.
It's not you're not having an experience like Macbeth or Othello. It's not a dramatized, you're not representing of an epoch.
Right.
But it's only domestic life, but yet it can cut very deep.
Right. We're a half century after the passage of the Civil Rights Act. We're still trying to create a society where everybody's treated with respect and equally.
That's so true.
You've returned to this theme in many of your novels for a long time. What draws you to that subject?
I've returned to that in my tweets. Well, it is sort of astonishing that after the 1960s, people actually died. They actually sacrificed themselves for, you know, the idea of civil rights and everybody should be treated equally. That still in 2016, we're still sort of working this out. It's a little bit, maybe a little dispiriting. However, we persevere. It just seems very natural. If you're a woman writer, you do have a natural proclivity to identify with women and girls. So those stories are abiding and are still being dramatized.
There's a weird tension I notice in response to literature. White authors, are encouraged to stop writing such monochromatic books, to include people of color.
Yeah.
And at the same time, they're criticized for presuming that they can imagine the lives of people not like themselves.
Yes.
How does an author negotiate those two seemingly contradictory demands?
Well, it's a good question. I know Jonathan Franzen has been often criticized for writing only about white people, especially white men, especially people like himself, I suppose. But and John Updike, for the most part, wrote about himself, and James Joyce and some others, that the idea of writing about yourself is a kind of safe thing to do, and you shouldn't therefore be at risk for making mistakes because you know what your perspective is.
Right.
But then somebody will say, oh, but you only wrote about white men. You know,
Right.
like John Updike only wrote about these small number of people. And it doesn't matter so much that he did write beautifully, and Jonathan Franzen writes with a certain degree of passion. But if they tried to write about other people, then of course they'd be devastatedly criticized for daring to go outside that. But I think it's just part of the risks that you take being an artist. Most artists are transgressive, and they do bring a lot of criticism. As Stravinsky's Rites of Spring, for instance, people were fighting and screaming in the audience, and the whole thing had to be sort of shut down. Now we hear the Rite of Spring. It's actually thrilling and exciting music. You know, it's really exciting with those strange rhythms. But at that time, it was offensive to some ears and upsetting. So people got in fistfights in the audience. But Stravinsky persevered, and so his music exists now. People who are writing music that was more comfortable to the ear of audiences didn't fight, those people may be forgotten.
Right, that's true. Do you think fiction has some sort of social function, some sort of social responsibility to bring about a more just society, or does that sound awful to you?
Oh, all artists are individuals, and I wouldn't prescribe for anybody. So I think the charge of cultural appropriation comes from people who need to have their perspective given attention and respect. So I wouldn't say that writers should write about anything we should write about what you want to write about. First of all, you can only write about things you care about.
Okay.
And if John Updike really cared very, very much about his own family, particularly his mother, he wrote often about his own mother and his father, but he wrote so lovingly and beautifully. It would be really wrong and almost wasteful of him to have tried to write from the point of view of, you know, a Chinese American or lesbian women or something, and kind of dealing with something else. It's just not natural. So I don't think people should be criticized for what they write or what they don't write. I think that's something that is very private and individual.
What about you? Do you feel some social impulse in your fiction, some sort of argument you're making, Upton Sinclair-like?
Well, sometimes I do. Yeah, I feel that when I write a novel, that I should for my own self, not for anybody else, but I feel I should dramatize a group of people rather than just individuals. And I almost never write a novel that's only really very, very intensely personal. It would always be about some representative people in a political and social context. So they might represent more than just themselves.
We spoke a few weeks ago, you said, in the last decade or so, I'm much more interested in letting other people talk.
Yes.
Whereas when I started, I was writing in my own voice.
Yes.
Tell me about what you mean other people talk. It all sounds, I mean, it's all your voice.
Well, if you look at a typical novel by Henry James, particularly a later work of Henry James, it's beautifully written. The language is all Henry James. It doesn't matter which novel you read, it will be Henry James's narrative voice. And that's a very beautiful voice. Then you look at James Joyce's Ulysses, and there's a certain rhythm of Joycean language that prevails in everything he writes, but each chapter is pretty different. And as you go through Ulysses and the different hours of the day, he takes you through a number of voices that are different. And it ends with Molly Bloom, which is a very different kind of sort of female voice.
Yes, yes.
Partially
yes.
based on maybe his own wife, who is sort of a non-intellectual person. So those are two ways of writing. Hemingway's prose is always Hemingway's voice, but Louise Erdrich will have novels where each chapter is a different person.
Yes.
And I'm drawn to that kind of writing where each person in a novel gets a kind of voice of his or her own rather than it all being my voice.
And you've developed into that. It interests you more now than it did when you started.
Yeah, well, when I started, I wouldn't have been able to do that.
Interesting.
For instance, in a play by Shakespeare or Chekhov or really anyone who's a dramatist, there are different voices on stage. Cleopatra does sound different from Julius Caesar, and Mark Antony sounds different from somebody else. Basically nobody would expect them all to sound alike. But with a Henry James novel or most of Faulkner, there's one narrative voice, and it's quite a difference. And when you're writing, you're sort of choosing that voice.
So when you are constructing a novel, you think of these different voices as separate consciousnesses as you write. You're like a playwright or an actress?
Yeah, the novel I'm writing now, each chapter has a different character. There are probably about 8 characters, and I go through them all. And some of them are really fun to write because they're kind of nasty. And I sort of discover this person is so sarcastic and really kind of funny.
No, wait, I have to stop you there.
And that's
you
not me.
discover that?
As I get into the character, she's really getting nastier all the time and having fun. Yeah, it's a little bit of a discovery after a few weeks. Then another person is a nice person, and nice people, we like to have them around, but they're kind of boring. They're sort of boring in a novel, so you don't want to stay with a nice person too long. You sort of move on to another person. And then a person who doesn't know what he's actually thinking or doing, and a person governed by the unconscious is very exciting to write because that person doesn't know as much as you know, and he starts to discover it. So they're all really different.
So if you're discovering as you work through the novel then you go back and rewrite the early parts of the novel knowing more than you did when you started?
Well, no, I write, each chapter is pretty much polished, and I do a lot of revision chapter by chapter.
Chapter by chapter? Oh,
Yeah.
interesting.
For instance, in my next novel that comes out in 2017, it's called A Book of American Martyrs, and there are two families. One is evangelical Christian family. They're very anti-abortion, and they're involved in anti-abortion activism. But then the other family is a secular family, and the father is an abortion provider. So it's basically two ways of looking at America. And there's a young woman in the novel, a girl who becomes a young woman who's actually a boxer. And she becomes, we see her kind of training, and she has her first fights. And that sensibility of a girl of 18 or so becoming a boxer is so different from my own life. You know, for me to write about her was so satisfying and so kind of wonderful, like I got to know a different person.
Mm-hmm.
But there are other people in the novel who are more educated, and they're maybe at universities, and more like myself. I'm a university person. So there's a satisfaction in selecting and enhancing a voice different from your own that has its own poetry. She's not that well educated, but she has her own sharp sensibility.
And you respect her.
Absolutely.
But what about those evangelical anti-abortionists? I imagine they do not line up with your own particular attitudes.
Well,
How do you keep from treating them in a pejorative way?
Oh, but from their point of view, they are very idealistic.
How do you, in the novel, keep them from looking like buffoons?
I don't think they are. I think they're acting from their own idealism, which is, in some cases, extraordinarily courageous. It's different from others. Like a person who goes out to assassinate someone for political or idealistic or religious reasons and throws away his own life, that is something that we don't want to do. When we don't think it's not good to do, it's illegal, and so forth. But from that point of view, though, the person is basically a martyr. You know, like that's what martyrs did, and that's what martyrs are. They threw away their own lives for some ideal. And while I don't think I would ever do anything like that, I'm very fascinated by that kind of strange, perhaps tragic courage.
So the novel works to the extent you can extend your own sympathies to each character.
I wouldn't write about people that I didn't like and respect.
About 40 years ago, the Paris Review asked you about the burdens of fame. And you said,
40 years ago, wow.
you said, I'm not really aware of being famous. I enjoy a certain degree of invisibility. And
Yes, that's true.
you do not now. I mean, you are truly famous now. Is it fun? Is it a burden?
Well, when I go home and my cats are there, the cats are so unimpressed. I think there are two kinds of people. It doesn't matter if you're famous or not, but dog people and cat people. Now, the dog people are always famous. You walk in, the dog comes licking, and you can be the most boring person. The dog is just kissing you. On the other hand, you can be very famous, but the cats just, they're yawning, you know, they're washing, they have other things to do. Finally, they come over and purr a little bit, you know, kind of slowly, and just to humor you, they purr. So I think anybody who's a cat person never really gets a swollen head, but we're always kind of humble.
Nice, very nice. You wrote a very funny piece in the Post a couple years ago.
Yes, that was fun.
In which a woman...
That was for you, I think.
It was. A woman stopped you in the grocery store and said, "Are you some kind of writer or what?"
Yes.
And you said, I shook my head no, as if I had not heard.
At the moment, I was just in the grocery store, you know, like the moment I really wasn't ready to talk about anything.
I mean, we think of you as a writer, but you said that when you're given a form to fill out, you always write teacher.
Teacher.
What is it you've enjoyed over your career as a teacher?
Well, I always loved school. When I was really little, like 6 years old, in first grade, I absolutely loved my teacher, and I loved the world of school with books and seats and desks and all that. So I think I always wanted to be a teacher before I knew about being a writer. And I've always really admired teachers, especially the kind of teachers who do really exhausting teaching. Now, I teach in a university, and my students are actually all wonderful. I have wonderful students. It's a pleasure to teach them. So I'm thinking about teachers who really have to work, who have students struggling with literacy,
Yes.
struggling with problems at home. Teachers who give so much of their lives, and are teaching every day, like 5 days a week. And most university professors might teach 2 or 3 days a week or 1 day a week, you know. So I'm very admiring of that kind of teaching.
And you took on voluntarily a sort of adventure in teaching to go teach in San Quentin.
San Quentin, that was interesting.
What drew you to take on that adventure?
Well, please don't think that I was terribly naive, but I thought I would like to work with women, incarcerated women. And so we went out to San Quentin, and I found out there are no women in San Quentin.
I didn't know that.
And my husband, who is a neuroscientist, and he was teaching with introduction to biology. So I was a little bit surprised, but I'm so often mistaken about things in life that I sort of pretend, you know, oh, of course. Of course I'm happy to teach these men. And they were mostly lifers, and they turned out to be really interesting people.
Really?
And very serious.
Serious students?
Serious students. In California, in the prison system, there's something called the Prison University Program, with capital letters. That is a degree-granting program, probably unique to the California prison system. You won't find that in all the states. In some states, you won't find even, you know, any courses. And so the prisoners who get this degree, it's equivalent to a community college degree.
Nice.
So all the prisoners in the program are very serious and hardworking.
They were literate? They could read?
They were in this program, but we didn't see everyone in San Quentin.
No, I'm sure, as we heard, the terrible statistics about literacy. But and it must have been quite a contrast from Princeton students to these people who had very rough lives. How did you find them as students?
Well, it was a different kind of situation. For a person in San Quentin, which is a maximum security prison, who's he's a lifer, that like 30 years to life, that doesn't mean they're in for life. It means that they might be, but they're all working for parole. They're working hard for parole, and none of them thought they were innocent. They didn't pretend or claim to be innocent. They had come to terms with the fact they made mistakes. Some of them made mistakes when they were like 17 or 18, and now they're 35 or 40. My oldest student was 61. They have a long time to think about the mistakes that they made, so they were serious students. Very different, I mean, much older than my Princeton students. So the comparison is it's a difficult comparison because the Princeton students are very young, and they've had lives in which they've always been in school.
And they've always done well.
They've always done well. Yeah, and the prisoners have had probably tragic lives and from broken homes and discontinuous school and different.
What an opportunity for both of you, both groups, you and these men.
Yeah, and then when I edited Prison Noir a few years later, I used a story written by one of my former students.
From the prison.
From that prison.
That's great. That's great.
But I looked at stories from all the many, many prisons in the United States. And Michigan is a very good state for education. Many of our applicants and submissions came from Michigan. And there were many states where there was nothing, like there's no courses in writing at all. New York State had some, but surprisingly not as much as other states.
It's been such a pleasure to talk to you. Would you take some questions from the audience now? Would you mind? There are 2 microphones here. We have time for 1 question. Yes, it will be you, sir.
I thought I actually learned something in one of your novels about a man I thought I knew something about, Woodrow Wilson.
Oh, yes. Quite a character.
Quite a character. And I wondered, how much license did you give yourself? Did you give yourself fictional license? Did you merely embellish? This is the man. How much of you, your visceral reaction to Woodrow Wilson and to what he represented and how he acted?
Well, that's a good question. This is about my novel, The Accursed, in which Woodrow Wilson, at the time in 1906, was president of Princeton University. Well, I did a lot of research and I read his letters. And some of his letters I take and sort of change the words around a little bit, but those are his words. You know, I don't want to completely criticize him because he was a man of his time. So he was a sexist, he was a male chauvinist, he was an anti-Semite, and he was a racist, okay? That's just the way they were, but he was also a reformist, and he was intelligent. He reformed Princeton University. He did a lot of things. I mean, it's shocking today that somebody who's a racist also did some good things, but at that time, it wasn't. It was more or less the way people were. So a lot of the things that are funny that he says, he actually said.
Oh my gosh.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's been such a pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much for coming to the festival.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.